Thank you, Scott, for your warm welcome. I must admit, though, I was just thinking as I was driving here this morning, we talked a little bit about the McGarry lectures that we were doing during the day, but you never actually told me how long I had for tonight. Yeah, what it was. So, who knows when we're going to get out of here at this rate? I figure that once we start on a topic like this, if we can get out of here before about 12 o'clock, we'll be doing well. But no.
If they shuffle their backsides too much,
my plan, just to let you know, will be to, I guess, talk through some of my ideas, my thinking around this topic for roughly an hour or so, depending on how things go, and then I'm happy to kind of take questions and we'll see where it goes. And when the questions start getting too difficult, that's when we'll call an end to the evening. So good evening, and thank you for having me here to share with you. As Scott said, I'm involved at Table. My current role is as head of the School of Ministry, Theology and Culture, which basically means I sit in office and get through a lot of boring administration and go to meetings, and I don't actually lecture anywhere near the amount that I used to. By training though, my PhD is in the Old Testament, and the subjects that I teach fall under the Old Testament banner. And whenever I meet someone new and they find out what I do, my area of interest is Old Testament, they usually come at me with one of two topics that they want me to talk about, or that they want to kind of ask me about. One is how to make sense of the Genesis creation accounts in the light of contemporary science and evolutionary theory. The other one is how to make sense of the apparently bloodthirsty, vengeful God of the Old Testament in the light of the loving and gracious God that we see in Jesus. I'm not sure which one scares me more. Anyway, tonight I've been asked to address the second issue. They haven't paid me enough to talk about Genesis and science, but maybe we'll do that one at a different time. Now, some Christians are quick to point the finger at Islam, or at least elements within Islam, for perpetuating violence on religious grounds. What we need to be honest about, though, what we need to be genuine about, I think, is that the biblical text itself, especially the Old Testament, contains a number of passages which condone violence in God's name, which describe either God or God's people acting in what we would probably consider to be quite disturbing ways which are apparently difficult to reconcile with Jesus' teaching to love our enemies and Paul's command to overcome evil with good. Now, the topic of violence in the Old Testament is an immense one, and there are so many different ways that we could approach it. What I've chosen to do in order to give a focus to our discussion is to concentrate primarily on those texts that we find in Deuteronomy, but also which extend into Joshua and Judges as well, which talk about the conquest of the Promised Land. So these texts, amongst other things, describe the widespread execution, or at least call for the widespread execution of the pre-existing inhabitants of the land, who we generically refer to as Canaanites. That's perhaps not the best term. There were actually multiple different people groups in Israel prior to the Israelites coming into the land, but we'll just lump them under the generic title Canaanite for simplicity. Let's have a look at a couple of these passages. The first one is from Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God, actually I better give you the context. Deuteronomy is basically a series of sermons that Moses is delivering to the people on the borders of the Promised Land. So they've journeyed from Sinai, where they've been given a covenant. They've kind of taken 40 years to travel through the wilderness, and they've arrived on the plains of Moab on the borders of the Promised Land. And the Lord, through Moses, gives the people a series of instructions, basically to prepare them for life in the land. And so this is part of the instructions. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're about to enter and occupy, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations mightier and more numerous than you, and when the Lord your your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. So this is something that we see prior to the entrance into the land, the Lord instructing Moses. We then have some narrative texts which actually talk about Israel's early life in the land. And so we get into the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 6, and this is all about the destruction of Jericho, which we're probably familiar with from the picture books and stories about walls falling down, those kind of things. But this is the part of the narrative. So the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. That's probably the part we're familiar with, we've heard about through Sunday school. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and they captured it. This is the part that we don't so much read about in Sunday school. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen and sheep and donkeys. They devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. I get varying responses when I work through these passages with my students. Some of them don't seem too shocked by them, and they kind of just accept it as part of God's word. Others, kind of though, I can kind of see the shock in their faces, because for some people, this is kind of the first time that they're actually encountering this kind of text. They're not necessarily familiar with these texts in the Bibles, and to that extent, they can be somewhat confrontational when we first work through them. So how might we approach these texts? How might we understand? Let me begin by telling you a story about a guy called Mark. Mark was born in a little town named Sinope, which is in the north of what is modern-day Turkey. Mark was raised as a Christian. He may have been the son of a bishop, but we're not entirely sure about that. We do know, however, that he was a really good businessman. And over time, he became a relatively wealthy ship owner. When Mark started reading the Old Testament for himself, he was confronted by what he found. And as he was working through the text, he kept coming across what he perceived to be contradictions between the Old Testament and the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. And he wrote all these down and he put them into a book which he entitled Antitheses. He came to the opinion that the God of the Old Testament, the God of Jews, the God of the law, was not, in fact, the same as the God of the New Testament, the God of Jesus, the God of grace. The God of the Old Testament was an inferior, lesser being, and disciples of Jesus were not to follow his commands or to listen to his instructions. Now, Mark may not have been a particularly deep thinker, but he was a pretty charismatic fellow, and he attracted people to his cause. He was also a good organiser, and he established a movement which spread throughout the Mediterranean world. And it was a very successful movement. In fact, shortly after his death, he nearly had more followers than opponents. Now, the person who I've been talking about as Mark is better known as Marcion. Marcion was active during the first half of the 2nd century AD. So to put that into more figures, say 100 to 150 AD. You see, this issue of trying to figure out the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the seemingly different pictures of God that we get in these two testaments, is almost as old as the church itself. It's an issue that the church has faced almost as long as it's been in existence. And it's my task to solve that issue for you in 1 hour this evening. Get on with it, yeah, that's right. But the reason why I talk about this, and the reason I introduce it like this, is because I want us to realise that this is an issue that doesn't have easy answers. Okay? If it was an issue that had easy answers, we probably would have solved it, or at least figured it out over the last 1800 or so years. Okay? But this is an issue that has continued to challenge the great thinkers, really, of Christian history. So tonight, I want to put forward 3 proposals or 3 possibilities for how we can approach these texts. My goal is basically to lay these 3 out before you. I'll cover them in different depths, but to lay these 3 out before you, these 3 possibilities, these 3 approaches. And I'll leave it up to you to make up your minds as to which one you find the most appropriate. I'm naughty, I'm not a preacher, I'm not going to tell you what you need to believe. I'm going to come as a lecturer, and I will lay out the 3 perspectives. I'll give you some of the arguments for and against, and you can take it away. There are lots of possibilities, there's lots of approaches for how we can go about dealing with these texts. I've only got time to cover the 3 what I think are significant ones. But if you are interested in this, if this is an issue that you find challenging, perhaps a text that I'd recommend is that one there. It's called Show Them No Mercy, which of course is taken from that last part of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 7 that we looked at. 4 views on God and Canaanite genocide. And so it looks at this issue has 4 different authors contributing to it, each taking a different perspective, and then everyone writes a response to the other people's contributions. So it's interesting book that does try to look at it from different angles. Okay. So, 3 different proposals, 3 possibilities for how we can approach the text. The first one, and this is probably the one that I'm going to spend the least amount of time working with, is that we accept the logic of the text, okay, that we find in the Old Testament. I want to spend the least time here because in some ways it's the most straightforward. The books of the Old Testament give a logic for what is happening when the people go into the land. It tries to explain and gives a justification for why the people are called to act in this way. Basically, the Old Testament, when you boil it down to it, explains this conquest, in part at least, as an act of judgment on the Canaanite sin. Okay? The Canaanites were a sinful people, and Israel, part of their reason for going in and destroying them is because they are wiping out, they're bringing God's judgment on a people group. Perhaps as Christians we struggle with this a little bit because we're used to conceiving of a final judgment, an end of judgment, end of days judgment, which God will bring. But the Old Testament and the New Testament itself actually points out that sometimes God will bring judgment within history, various points within history. The biggest example of this in the Old Testament is what happens around 586, where the Babylonian armies come through and they wipe out Jerusalem, which the Old Testament explains in part as being God's judgment on the sins of the covenant people. And so the Old Testament explains this act as a judgment on the Canaanite sin. And the Old Testament is quite willing to suggest that human beings can be used as instruments of God's will. They will be tools in God's hand to bring both salvation and judgment. Again, that's something perhaps we're not as familiar with. We tend to think that God himself will save or judge, but the Old Testament suggests that, well, actually God will work in and through human beings, both to save, to deliver, but also to judge as well, at times. And so, the basic perspective that we find coming through the Old Testament is that how do we understand these texts? How do we approach these texts? Well, these texts are describing one act of God's judgment against the sins of the Canaanite people. So this is what is taking place here. And so, that's one of the explanations, that's one of the perspectives, and that's been embraced by many people throughout church history, that what is happening here is an act of judgment on the Canaanites' sin. Some people, though, view this perspective as potentially problematic Because for them, God seems to be all too ready to act in ways that seem to be incompatible with the kind of God we see revealed in Jesus. Okay? The calling for the wide-scale, the widespread extermination of a people group doesn't really match with the picture of God that we see revealed in Jesus. And so for these people, since there does seem to be this inconsistency, we perhaps need to look at different possibilities or different options or different ways of approaching. So, our second approach is to consider getting rid of these passages. To simply cut them out of the Bible. We would do this on the basis that it is impossible to reconcile these statements, calling for the widespread destruction of the Canaanites, with the person and teachings of Jesus that we find in the New Testament. And since Jesus is the ultimate and supreme revelation of God, he is the one in whom God is made known ultimately, the Old Testament authors must have got it wrong. Moses and Joshua were mistaken in their understanding of God. They thought God told them to annihilate the Canaanites, but they were wrong. Therefore, we can feel free to ignore these passages. We don't need to worry about them because they don't simply make sense in the light of what we see in Jesus. They've got it wrong. This was essentially the approach of Marcion. He suggested, well, these don't match what we see in the New Testament. Let's get rid of them. Marcion did it for slightly different reasons. Marcion did it because he didn't think the God of the Old Testament was the same as the God of the New Testament. We might not want to affirm that, but we still may think that what we see revealed here doesn't actually match the God of the New Testament, and therefore we don't accept it as being part of God's word. Now, if we follow the lead of Marcion through to its logical conclusion, we'd actually be left with a much smaller Bible. Maybe some of you might think that's a good thing. I don't know. But if we were to follow the lead of Marcion, we'd get rid of the Old Testament altogether. But we also might need to rethink some of the New Testament as well. Because lots of the New Testament actually quotes from the Old Testament and seems to view this material approvingly. And it refers to the conquest of Canaan on a number of occasions without really batting an eye. It just accepts it as part of the narrative. If that's the case, surely these passages in the New Testament must themselves be suspect. And so Marcion got rid of all the Gospels apart from Luke, which he had to edit down a little bit. And kind of, I've got in my mind, a military document which has been redacted, black lines. He's kind of going through his document, kind of crossing out the parts that don't quite match up with what he had to, what he believed. He got rid of all of the Gospels apart from Luke. He also got rid of all the non-Pauline epistles. He loved Paul because Paul was kind of that person who juxtaposed the God of grace with the God of law in the Old Testament. He also got rid of the book of Revelation. Now, Protestant Christians typically work with a canon of 66 books. Okay? Marcion got that down to 11. So he had a version of Luke, and he had 10 or so of the letters of Paul. The problem is, once you start down this path, once you start tearing out pages, it can be a little hard to know when to stop. And then just keep on going. Now, very few modern Christians are explicit Marcionites. Okay? Perhaps we don't have the guts to come out and say that we don't actually believe the Old Testament, or at least the violent sections of it, is the Word of God. But more, I would suggest, would be implicit or virtual Marcionites. We don't come out and reject the Old Testament altogether. We don't rip out those pages from our Bibles. But for all intents and purposes, those pages don't really exist. we don't read them, we don't study them, and certainly we don't preach from them. If you want to go down this path, and if you want to if this is going to be your way of approaching the text, if you think that they are simply irreconcilable with the God of love that we see in the New Testament, the challenge that I think you need to face, the key question, the key issue that you need to struggle with is, on what basis am I ignoring these Old Testament passages? Or another way of putting that is, by what criteria will I affirm whether or not I will view this passage as God's word? Okay? I'm concerned here with trying to get to your thinking. Why or why aren't you accepting this? Why or why don't you have problems with this passage? Now, the most common, and I think the most satisfactory answer to these questions is one that I've alluded to already. What's going to be our key criteria? What have I suggested? What's the key issue? Persons and teaching of Jesus. Okay, that is going to be, because he is the supreme revelation, he is the one by which we can judge things. Okay. So the person and teachings of Jesus is the key. They become the criteria for identifying or discerning answering these questions. And so if there's congruency between what we find in the Old Testament and the teachings of Jesus, well, that's fine. We can accept it, we can work with it. But if not, we have a problem. And the problem's not with the Old Testament. Sorry, the problem's not with Jesus. The problem's with the Old Testament. Okay, the problem's not with Jesus. Now, I guess I can work with this. At least if you're asking these questions, there is an intellectual integrity to your approach. But the challenge I would lay down before you, if you go down this path, is that if you are going to walk this journey, and it's a pretty brave journey, if you are going to walk it, I think you need to make sure that you develop an accurate picture of who Jesus was, what he said, and what he did. In other words, you need to do some exegetical work to figure out what Jesus was on about. If he is going to become your criteria by which you start to decide what is and what isn't going to be a part of the Bible. If we don't do this, if we don't put in the work, we will tend, actually I'm going to be strong with that, I'm not going to say tend, I'm going to say we will guarantee, I can guarantee you that what you will end up doing is recreating Jesus in our own or in our culture's image. Okay? I'll virtually guarantee you that Jesus will simply become a teacher of 21st century Western, probably postmodern thought, okay? If you don't put in the exegetical work. Why do I say that? I teach a subject at Tabor called Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. One of the key concepts that I introduce to students in this class is the concept of cultural reflex. Okay? Not reflux, cultural reflex. Okay? Cultural reflex essentially involves us imposing our culture or our worldview onto the ancient text. Okay? And this process, the reason why it's tricky is because this process actually happens automatically and subconsciously. What happens is that by default, we assume that the way things were back then are the same as the way things are now, and therefore we impose our culture. We read that in the light of our culture. That's what will happen by default. We only know our culture. We only know our worldview, and unless we do research, what we will tend to do is simply impose our culture and impose our worldview onto the text. And you don't need me to tell you that this will often be problematic. Okay? The ancient world was very different from the modern world, and we can't simply impose our world onto it. And we will do the same thing with Jesus Christ. Unless we consciously fight it, unless we consciously resist it, unless we put in the exegetical work, what we are likely to do is impose what our culture teaches, what our culture values, what our culture assumes onto the teachings of Jesus. Okay? What we will end up doing is that we will conform Jesus' teachings to what is normative in our own day. Okay? Because we're culture-bound creatures. We live at a certain time, we live at a certain place. We have a whole realm of teachings and assumptions that affect us that we're not even necessarily aware of. And that will distort, essentially, the way that we read the New Testament. Furthermore, we all have a tendency to recreate Jesus in our own image. I hope you heard the heresy when I said that, okay? We recreate Jesus in our own image. We think he looks like us, we think he acts like us, we think he believes the same thing as us. We often laugh, or at least you should laugh, when you see images of that, of Jesus, okay? Horrified when you see, images of that Jesus, of kind of blonde hair, white-skinned, blue-eyed Jesus, okay? And you couldn't get actually much more of an incorrect view in some ways. How could anyone be so stupid to think that that's what Jesus looks like? But I would actually suggest that this is something we all do, whether we're aware of it or not. We all actually recreate Jesus in our own image. In my introduction to biblical interpretation class, in one lecture, I get my students to fill out a quiz. This is a quiz that's been developed by a New Testament professor in the States. The quiz has got 3 parts to it. In the first part, there is a series of questions about the student. Okay? So stuff like, what is your personality? What kind of personality do you have? What's your temperament? What do you think about issue X? Okay, there'll be about a series of 20 or so questions. That's the first part of the quiz. The second part of the quiz is that basically the student has to go through and they tick a series of boxes which relate to their course of study. So are you doing a BA? What's your major? Are you in your first year or your third year? Are you male or female? Is your denominational background Baptist, United Church, Church of Christ, whatever? I don't think there's actually a point to that second block of questions. But what it's designed to do is provide a break between the first block and the third block. Okay? Now, in the third block, they're essentially the same questions as was asked in the first block, but instead of applying the questions to the students, those questions are now applied to Jesus. So instead of asking, what kind of personality do you have, the question asks, what kind of personality did Jesus have? Okay? What was Jesus' temperament? What did Jesus think about issue X? Okay? Understand how the quiz works? You can probably guess what the responses statistically show over time. Okay? Statistically, they show that people think that Jesus is the same as them. Okay? That their image of Jesus matches who they are. That they have recreated Jesus in their own image. And so I think we need to be careful that if we're going to use the character of Jesus, if we're going to use the teachings of Jesus as our key criteria for affirming or discarding these passages from the Old Testament, well then we better make sure that we've actually figured out Jesus' character and Jesus' teaching. Okay? It's pretty important. We have to come to grips with his character and with his teachings rather than simply reading our culture or reading our common understandings back into the Bible. We have to come to grips, for instance, with a Jesus who introduces the concept of hell into the Bible. The God of the Old Testament never talks about sending people to hell. But again, that's a topic for another evening. And you're certainly not paying me enough to talk about that topic. Okay.
Offering back.
Pardon?
The offering back.
Offering back. tomorrow morning. Okay. Now for me, Marcion got at least one thing right. He showed that there was a deep and pervasive connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay? Whether we like it or not. He took seriously that if a text in the New Testament mirrored closely the Old Testament, then you needed to get rid of it. And therefore, how much of the New Testament did he get rid of? 16 books out of 27. He got rid of, I think it's about 60% of the New Testament books. Okay? He showed that there is, whether you want to or not, he showed that there is a clear and decisive connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the third approach that I want to share with you tonight is based on the assumption that the text we find in the Old Testament, the texts that describe God commanding or condoning violence, are in fact to be associated with the God of the New Testament, the God whom Christians worship. This approach suggests that we should not uncritically embrace these texts, nor should we discard them. But we need to appreciate them in the light of the way that God works in the world. So, my third suggestion, my third consideration for how we're to approach these texts. We may view these texts as a reflection of the God who compromises. Okay. Some of you may find that statement a little bit radical. Some of you may find it a little bit uncomfortable. Some of you may find it heretical. I hope so. That's why I actually said it, because I wanted to get some sort of response. Okay? That we view these texts as a reflection of the God who compromises. What I mean by God compromises is that God meets people where they're at. God may have an ideal, but this doesn't always come to pass. God works in the world. He works in and with fallen and sinful human beings and all the complexity that that brings to get things done. To put it another way, and this is to put it in bold contrast, the sovereign God of the universe doesn't get exactly what he wants 100% of the time. Sometimes he opts, or at least allows, humans to act in less than ideal ways. In this way, God is a lot like a human parent. I may know what is best, or at least I think I know what is best for my children. I know what is ideal. But sometimes I allow my children to get their own way. My folks are here tonight. Perhaps they'd say I allow that too much. I don't know. But sometimes I allow my children to get their own way. I allow them to act in ways which I might think are less than ideal. Let me give you two examples from the Bible. I'll go from one from the Old Testament and also one from the New Testament as well, to try to show you that there is some biblical basis to what I'm saying and that I'm just not making things up as we go along. God compromises. The first has to do with the inauguration of the kingship, or the inauguration of the monarchy in ancient Israel. The key text here is 1 Samuel 8. Context, I don't need to explain the context of 1 Samuel 8, you all know about that off the top of your head. Sure. Yeah, okay. The context of 1 Samuel 8 is basically that Samuel is currently leading Israel. He's the current judge over the nation. But he has grown old, and his sons have proven themselves to be less than ideal leaders. They're not really living up to the mandate. And so the elders of Israel come to Samuel, and they demand that he appoint a king to govern them, just like all the other nations around them have. Now the Lord recognises that this is a rejection of him as king over Israel. This is not his ideal for the nation. His ideal for the nation is that he, as king, will rule his people. but he realises that this is what the people want, and so he allows them to have their king, even though he's aware of the challenges and the costs that that will bring. God compromises. He allows the people to have their way. The other time we see this working is, I've got it up there, Jesus' teaching around divorce and adultery that we find in Mark chapter 10. So I'll just open it up. If you've got your Bibles there, you might want to open them as well. Mark chapter 10. Now the context for this is that Jesus has travelled to Judea, and some Pharisees have come out to test him. Basic question that they lead off with is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, in Jesus' response, he points back to the Genesis creation text. And he argues that divorce is not God's ideal. Okay? Marriage, according to the creation text, is meant to be permanent. It's meant for life. It's two people coming together. Nevertheless, laws were written that allowed a man to issue a certificate of dismissal and to divorce his wife. Why were those laws given? What does it say in verse 5? But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this command. Because of the hardness of your heart. Divorce, I don't think, is God's ideal. God would like to see all marriages last, and I know there's all complexities around that. We live in a fallen and broken and sinful world. And therefore, God is willing to compromise because he knows that he is dealing with fallen and sinful human beings. And so he provides provision for divorce. God compromises. Doesn't get him exactly what he wants 100% of the time because he's working with sinful human beings. So how does this all apply to the violent texts of the Old Testament? The first thing I'd want to say, and the first thing that I think we need to emphatically assert, is that God's ideal is not the death of the wicked. Okay? That's the potential, one of the potential downsides of that first approach, that we think that the death of the wicked is found, that's perfectly fine, that's perfectly acceptable. God's cool with that. Okay? God's ideal is not the death of the wicked. Okay? This comes through quite clearly in Ezekiel 33. God does not take pleasure in the death of the wicked. It's not that God wants to act in judgment. His ideal is that the wicked will turn from their ways and live. God takes no delight in the death of anyone. On this basis, I think we can assert that his ideal for Israel would have been to give the people a land, but that this would not have involved bloodshed. The people would simply have been able to settle peacefully and go about being the people of God in the land of Israel. But God is also aware that this is not possible with human beings the way they are. They will not simply give up land to another group, and so God has to compromise. He condones a military invasion. This may not be God's ideal. This may not be what God would want or what God would hope for. But it is what needs to take place in order to establish the people of God through whom God plans to work. And in this context, I think it's worth noting, or at least interesting to note, that it is the people of Israel themselves who propose this form of warfare. Okay? Yahweh didn't invent the idea of annihilating a people It was actually a relatively common idea in the ancient world, an idea which Israel picks up, and the idea which Israel proposes, and which God accepts. The first reference we actually find to this kind of warfare is in Numbers 21. And this actually takes place before the people enter into the Promised Land. It's associated with the defeat of the Canaanite king of Aram. Aram is located down in the south. Here, it is an idea that the people themselves propose. We will go in and we will do this. And while this form of warfare, putting to death an entire population, may sound extreme to us, we need to be aware that it actually wasn't all that uncommon in the biblical world. Evidence for this practice can actually be found from outside the text of the Old Testament. I've got a picture up there of a stone tablet. It's referred to as the Misha Stele, and it's located in the Louvre in Paris. I don't know if you can make it out, but there's different colours of the document there, or different colours of the stele there. Some of it's in dark black, some of it's in brown. What actually happened is that they discovered it, I think, in modern-day Jordan, and it was actually an Anglican missionary who discovered it, and he recognised the value of it. So he had a squeeze of it made, which is basically where they press papier-mâché against the text, and they get an impression of what the text said. So he did that. It was quite fortunate that he did that, because he left and the local Bedouin tribesmen started arguing, and what they decided to do was actually to smash the Misha Stele into pieces and to hopefully sell it piece by piece, potentially as a way of maximising their income from the document. The only problem was, of course, that when it got smashed, part of it got lost. Okay, and so we don't actually have the original for the whole document anymore. We've only got the impression plus the parts that have remained. It's called the Misha Stele. It's actually named after a guy called Misha, who was king of Moab. Misha is mentioned in the biblical text. And the document dates to sometime around the middle of the 9th century BC. It describes his achievements as king, and in particular it focuses on 2 achievements. What do we think they're going to be for a king in the ancient world? Killing a lot of people, okay, so his military conquests. The other thing? Pardon? Land, kind of. His building activities as well. These are the 2 things that were claimed to fame for a king in the ancient world. Your military prowess and your building capabilities. Okay. There are whole lots of interesting parallels between this text and the biblical text. In fact, it's probably the close out of all of the ancient Near Eastern documents. It provides the closest perspective to the kind of text that we have in the Old Testament. I've got a passage here, just an excerpt. You can find the broader document online. This is what it says: "Go, take Nebo from Israel. And I went in the night, and I fought against it from the break of dawn until noon. And I took it, and I killed its whole population, 7,000 male citizens and aliens, and female citizens and aliens and servant girls. For I had put it to the ban, I had devoted it for Ashtar Chemosh." Okay, Ashtar Chemosh is the name of their local god. This text suggests that the kind of warfare which the biblical text describes, involving not just combatants, but entire families, seems to have been a relatively common practice in the ancient world, or at least it was a practice that was not unheard of. This is also a way in which the ancient world is different from the modern world. This kind of helps me to understand what's taking place, although it's not a total solution. Remember before that I said in terms of cultural reflex, we've got to be careful of imposing our culture back onto the ancient world. In the modern world, the basic unit of society is the individual. Okay? So when we go around and take a census, we count how many individuals are living within a household. Mother, father, children, grandparents, whatever it may be. We focus on the individual. And that's because the individual is capable of surviving by themselves in the modern world. Okay? An individual can go out and get a job, they can rent a house, they can pay the mortgage, they can cover the utilities, they can live, they can survive. Okay? An individual is the basic unit of survival in our world, it's the basic unit that makes up our society. Okay? It's not really how it worked in the ancient world. Okay? The basic unit of society in the ancient world is not so much the individual, it's more the family. Okay? And probably an extended family as well. It's grandparents, parents, the children, perhaps the grandchildren living together. Individuals, though, don't have the same value, they don't have the same distinction as they do in the modern world. In the ancient world, an individual couldn't survive by themselves, okay? Especially if you are not a male adult. Okay? If you are not a male adult, you would find survival in the ancient world very, very difficult. And so the basic unit of society in the ancient world is the family. So I think part of the problem why we struggle with these texts is that we see each and every individual as being distinct and unique and important. And yes, they are. That's not necessarily the same way that they saw things in the ancient world. People were part of families. And that's why also in the Old Testament it talks about the sins of the fathers being visited on the children, because they are one corporate entity, they are one people group. We don't divide them up. And so we see in these passages and other texts a form of warfare that involved not just combatants but entire people groups, families, and not just warring individuals. So in summary, the third possibility, the third way of approaching these texts is to view them as God authorising Israel to act in a way which was consistent with warfare in the broader ancient Near Eastern world. This may not have been ideal. This may not have reflected God's ultimate desire. But God was committed to working through a people. And this involved giving them a land. And in the ancient Near East, there was only really one way that you could acquire large portions of land, and that was to conquer. So I've laid out three possible ways for you to approach these texts. The first is to accept and to work with the logic of the text, that these are talking about God's judgment against a people group because of their sinful nature. The second option is to consider excising them from your Bible. But again, I think we need to be careful if we go down that route about our criteria, our basis. The third possibility is to recognise that in these texts, they may not represent God's ideal, they may not represent God's ultimate desire, but they do reflect the way in which God tends to work, and that God works with real people, that God meets people where they're at, in all their sinness and all their finitude and all the challenges and the difficulties that that raises. And that therefore warfare was a part of that, relating part of that interaction. I want to conclude by saying, whichever approach we take, I strongly believe that there is no basis for using these texts to justify later conquests or later acts of violence. You may think that that's simple, that's plain and that's straightforward, but if you look back over the history of the church, you do actually see this popping up again and again and again, that these texts are used to justify subsequent conquests, subsequent acts of violence. What we see happening here is a one-off event in the history of Israel. This is an exceptional practice in the Old Testament. Annihilating other peoples wasn't Israel's regular approach to them. Okay? To put it another way, what seems to be happening here is actually an aberration. This is not the normal way the people of God act. And therefore, we can't use it as the normal way that we might choose to act.